I always believed that my life was a portrait of the American dream, a steady rhythm of success, comfort, and loyalty. My name is John Anderson, and for years, I prided myself on the stability of my family life in the quaint town of Maplewood. Outwardly, everything seemed perfect. I worked as an architect, a profession that demanded precision and creativity, and I enjoyed the admiration of my peers for designing homes that mirrored the aspirations of many. But more than that, I cherished the life I had built with my wife, Emily. I still remember the day I met Emily at a local charity event. Her presence was mesmerizing, warm hazel eyes that sparkled with kindness and a smile that could transform even the bleakest day into a moment of hope. From that day forward, she became my confidant, my partner, and my best friend. Every Sunday, we would attend church and then share a hearty breakfast at our favorite diner, a ritual that always made me feel grounded in love and purpose. Walking hand in hand along the tree-lined streets of Maplewood, I felt certain that I had found a once-in-a-lifetime treasure. But as time went on, I began noticing subtle changes, small, almost imperceptible shifts in the woman I adored. At first, I dismissed them as natural evolutions in a long-term relationship. Late returns from work, a habit of sneaking glances at her phone during dinner, and moments when her eyes seemed to wander as if searching for something beyond our routine, all of these signs whispered secrets that I wasn't ready to acknowledge. I told myself it was merely the ebb and flow of a marriage that had grown comfortable and perhaps a bit too predictable. One chilly autumn evening, as the leaves outside turned brilliant shades of amber and gold, I encountered a moment that would forever alter my perspective. After a particularly long day at the office, I walked into our study expecting the usual quiet solitude. Instead, I was met with soft, hushed laughter, a sound that, while familiar in its warmth, carried an unexpected tone of intimacy that did not belong to the Emily I knew. I paused in the doorway, my heart pounding, as I tried to make sense of what I had heard. The room was empty when I looked, yet the echo of that laughter lingered in the air like a ghost from another life. In the days that followed, I found myself trapped in a vortex of uncertainty. Every small detail, every unaccounted hour, began to form a puzzle that I was reluctant to solve. Was I just imagining things, or was there something more, something hidden beneath the surface of our seemingly perfect life? I started questioning the very foundation of the life I had known so well. Emily had always been vibrant and full of dreams. She once talked excitedly about spontaneous adventures and far-off places. But lately, she seemed content to let the days pass without passion, as if she were merely playing a role in a script that no longer belonged to her. In quiet moments alone, I began to wonder if the woman I married had been quietly retreating behind a mask, one that shielded a secret she was desperate to keep. The comfort of our familiar routines now felt like a gilded cage, and I could no longer ignore the nagging feeling that something was profoundly amiss. Unbeknownst to me, these early signs were only the beginning of a storm that would shatter the illusions I had held so dear. In the weeks following that unsettling evening, I found myself drifting through a haze of confusion and suspicion. My mind replayed that echo of laughter from the study over and over, like a broken record that refused to let go of its secret. I began scrutinizing every nuance of our daily life, searching desperately for a clue that might explain the sudden change in Emily's behavior. Every misplaced word or unexplained moment felt like another thread in a tangled web I was slowly unraveling. At first, I tried to convince myself that these were nothing more than the natural rhythms of a long marriage, a phase where passion might dwindle and familiarity might breed complacency. But as days turned into restless nights, the feeling of betrayal grew heavier with each passing moment. I noticed how Emily's smiles, once filled with genuine warmth, now seemed fleeting and tinged with something I couldn't quite decipher. She'd often catch my lingering gaze, and for a fleeting second, I saw a shadow of guilt flicker behind her eyes. It was a look I couldn't shake, a silent admission that there was more to her distance than mere fatigue or distraction. I began to question every shared moment. Our quiet breakfasts, which once felt like sacred rituals, now echoed with unspoken words. I found myself lost in thought as I sipped my coffee, wondering if the conversations we once cherished were simply rehearsed performances meant to mask a deeper truth. Every laugh, every touch, began to feel like a carefully constructed facade, one that shielded a reality too painful to confront. My heart ached with the realization that I might have been blind to the changes unfolding right under my nose. My suspicions reached a tipping point one rainy afternoon. I returned home earlier than usual, driven by an inexplicable urge to confront the uncertainty that had taken root inside me. The house was silent when I arrived, a silence so thick I could almost feel it pressing against my skin. I crept through the corridors, each step heavy with dread, until I reached the study. The room was as I remembered it, orderly, with shelves lined with books and mementos of happier times. Yet, there was an undeniable shift in the atmosphere, as if the room itself harbored secrets it longed to keep hidden. In a moment of daring, I decided to search for any sign that might explain Emily's recent behavior. I opened her handbag, a habit I never imagined I would indulge in, and rummaged through its contents. Among the usual items, a makeup pouch, a novel, a few receipts, there was a small, neatly folded piece of paper that immediately sent a chill down my spine. It was a handwritten note, its contents both ambiguous and suggestive, signed simply with the name Michael. The note was casual, almost playful in tone, but every word stung with the weight of betrayal. I couldn't bring myself to read it aloud. Instead, I folded it back and placed it carefully on the desk, as if its mere existence was a silent indictment of everything I had believed in. Questions tormented me: who was Michael? What had he done with my wife? And most importantly, how long had this deception been simmering beneath the surface of our life together? The note, though small and seemingly insignificant, shattered the illusion I had clung to for so long. It confirmed my deepest fears, transforming vague suspicions into a stark, painful reality. I spent that night awake, wrestling with the torrent of emotions that surged within me. Anger, sorrow, disbelief, they all battled for dominance as I lay in the dark, the silence of our home amplifying every heartbeat. I recalled the bright, optimistic woman I had once known, a woman whose dreams were as vast as the skies, and wondered where that Emily had gone. Had the spark that once lit up her eyes been extinguished by a desire for something more, a life beyond the boundaries of our comfortable existence? The next morning, the weight of that discovery pressed upon me like an invisible burden. Every corner of our home seemed to whisper reminders of betrayal. I felt isolated in a place that was once a sanctuary of love. With trembling hands and a heavy heart, I resolved to confront the inevitable truth. I knew that avoiding the conversation any longer would only allow the deceit to deepen further. I had to understand the full extent of what had been hidden from me, even if it meant shattering the life I thought I knew. I spent the day preparing myself for the confrontation, rehearsing words I never imagined I would have to speak. Each moment was a struggle between the desire to cling to the past and the need to face the future head-on, no matter how painful it might be. As dusk approached, I found myself standing at the threshold of a moment that would define the rest of my life, a moment where I would have to demand the truth from the woman I loved, and in doing so, face the possibility of losing her forever. The moment of confrontation arrived sooner than I had anticipated. That evening, as the sky transitioned from a melancholy gray to the deep hues of twilight, I stood in our living room, grappling with a maelstrom of emotions. The silence of the house was almost deafening, punctuated only by the irregular rhythm of my heart. I knew that tonight, the carefully constructed facade of our marriage would be stripped away, revealing the raw truth beneath. When Emily finally walked in through the front door, I could see the weight of the day etched on her face, her usual smile replaced by an uneasy expression. For a fleeting moment, our eyes met, and I saw the apprehension that I had long tried to ignore. The sight was enough to freeze me in place, but I knew that I could not remain paralyzed by fear and doubt any longer. "Emily," I began, my voice steadier than I felt, "we need to talk." The words hung in the air, heavy with implications and unspoken accusations. She hesitated at the doorway, as if each step toward me demanded a leap into the unknown. Finally, she closed the door behind her, her movements betraying a mixture of reluctance and resignation. We moved into the study, the same room where I had found the note that shattered my world. The room, once a safe haven filled with memories of shared dreams, now felt ominous and charged with tension. I sat down at the desk, the piece of paper with Michael's name still pressed against my heart like a cursed relic, and gestured for her to join me. For a long, silent moment, we both sat there, the weight of unspoken truths pressing in from all sides. Finally, Emily spoke in a voice that was barely more than a whisper, "John, what is it that you want to know?" Her tone was calm, almost too calm, as if she had rehearsed this conversation 100 times in her mind. I took a deep breath and held up the note. "Where did this come from, Emily?" I asked, my voice trembling slightly as I tried to maintain control. "Who is Michael, and why did I never hear about him until now?" Each word was laced with hurt and disbelief, the accusation hanging between us like a fragile glass ornament ready to shatter. Her eyes dropped to the note, and I could see the flicker of panic that quickly transformed into resignation. For a few long seconds, the only sound was the soft hum of the ceiling fan overhead. Then, with a voice that quavered with the weight of her confession, she began, "John, I never wanted to hurt you. I didn't plan for any of this to happen." Her admission was both a relief and a fresh surge of anguish. Part of me desperately longed for the explanation that might bring closure, while another part of me recoiled at the thought of what her words might reveal. "Explain, please," I urged, the words heavy with a mixture of hope and dread. Emily's eyes shimmered with unshed tears as she sank into the chair across from me. "It started as a connection, something I didn't fully understand. Michael, he made me feel seen, heard. At a time when I felt lost in our routine, he was the one who stirred emotions I thought I had long buried." Her voice wavered, and I could hear the internal conflict in every syllable. "I know it's wrong, and I know you're hurting right now, but I felt so alone, John. I felt like I was fading away from the person I once was." Every word struck me like a blow. The image of our once vibrant love was now marred by the harsh reality of betrayal. I struggled to contain the surge of emotions, anger, sorrow, and disbelief, swirling inside me. "But you never talked to me about this," I managed to say, my voice cracking with the strain of trying to understand her betrayal. "How could you let this happen without ever telling me what you were going through?" Tears began to spill down her cheeks as she tried to explain, "I was scared, John. Scared of losing everything if I admitted that I was unhappy, that I craved something different. I didn't want to shatter our life, so I kept it hidden." Her confession was a bitter pill to swallow. I felt as though I were listening to the disintegration of the love that had once defined us, a love that now lay in ruins, scattered like fragments of a broken mirror. I sat back, grappling with the reality that everything I had believed in was now up for debate. The room seemed to close in around us as I searched for words that could bridge the widening chasm between us. In that charged silence, I realized that the confrontation was just the beginning of a painful journey, a journey that might forever alter the contours of our lives. "Emily," I finally said, the name feeling both familiar and foreign on my tongue, "I need you to be honest with me. How long has this been going on?" My question, though simple, was loaded with the urgency of seeking a truth that had been buried too deeply for too long. Her gaze met mine, full of regret and sorrow, as she whispered, "Too long, John. I wish I could change it all." The raw honesty in her voice was both a solace and a torment, leaving me with more questions than answers, and a heart heavy with the burden of betrayal. In the immediate aftermath of our heart-wrenching confrontation, the world around me blurred into a surreal haze. I remember sitting in the study long after Emily's confession, the room's familiar walls now transformed into silent witnesses of a broken trust. Every piece of furniture, every framed photograph, now seemed to mock me with memories of a happier past, a past that was now irretrievably altered. I could feel the tremors of my own shock coursing through me, as if the ground beneath had suddenly given way. My mind raced through the revelations, each one punctuating the air with the gravity of betrayal. Emily's words echoed over and over, "Too long, John. I wish I could change it all. In that moment, I felt as though the weight of every unsaid emotion, every overlooked detail, and every unheeded warning had finally converged into a crushing reality. Unable to bear the silence of the room any longer, I excused myself to the solitude of our once shared bedroom. There, I collapsed onto the edge of our neatly made bed, a bed that now symbolized both intimacy and isolation. I stared blankly at the ceiling, my thoughts a disordered jumble. How had the vibrant woman I had loved transformed into someone so lost and conflicted? And what did this mean for us? The very foundation of our shared life seemed to be crumbling, and I was left to navigate the ruins with nothing but raw emotions as my guide. I found myself questioning everything, my choices, my perceptions, even my own worth. The betrayal felt like a personal failure, a blind spot in my ability to see the signs that had been screaming at me all along. Each memory we had forged together now felt like a carefully constructed illusion, one that had hidden the underlying truths too painful to confront. My heart pounded with a mix of anger and sorrow, and every beat was a reminder that nothing would ever be the same. In the quiet moments that followed, I wandered through the empty halls of our home, grappling with the staggering loneliness of knowing that someone I had trusted so implicitly could conceal such a profound secret. The silence was heavy, as if the walls themselves were mourning the disintegration of our relationship. I recalled the days when our home was filled with laughter and light, and I couldn't help but feel that those days were now relics of a life that had slipped away, piece by piece. During that restless night, sleep eluded me as I lay awake wrestling with a tumult of conflicting emotions. I oscillated between despair and a desperate need to understand why Emily had felt compelled to seek solace in another's arms, and why I had been so blind to her gradual withdrawal. Every memory of shared smiles and whispered promises felt like a bittersweet mockery of the truth that was unfolding before me. In the early hours of the morning, as the first hints of dawn crept through the curtains, I finally resolved to confront the inevitable, the need for clarity in the midst of this emotional wreckage. I knew that the next conversation with Emily would demand a level of honesty and vulnerability that neither of us was fully prepared for. It was no longer a matter of simply unraveling the details of her betrayal, it was a quest for understanding the depths of our individual pain, and the extent to which we had lost ourselves along the way. Determined to find some semblance of resolution, I returned to the study where our fateful conversation had taken place. I sat down at the desk, my fingers tracing the worn edges of the note that had sparked this cascade of revelations. The piece of paper now seemed to carry not just the weight of Michael's name, but the cumulative burden of every moment of neglect and silence that had preceded it. I knew that the answers I sought might not come easily, and that the path to healing, if there was any hope of it, would be fraught with painful introspection. The next few days blurred together as I struggled to reconcile the person I thought I knew with the truth that had been laid bare. I oscillated between confronting Emily directly and retreating into the isolation of my own thoughts. The atmosphere in our home had become charged with a palpable tension, as though the very air was thick with unspoken grievances and regret. Emily, too, seemed to be engulfed in a sea of remorse and uncertainty. Our interactions became brief and laden with awkward pauses, each one a silent acknowledgement of the gulf that had opened between us. One particularly crisp morning, I decided to address the simmering tension head-on. Over coffee, in the quiet of the kitchen, I mustered the courage to broach the subject once more. "Emily," I began, my voice low and tentative, "I need to know. How did we get here? When did we stop being us?" My words were laced with both desperation and a yearning for truth. The question hung in the air, heavy with the unspoken pain of a love in crisis. Emily's eyes filled with tears as she took a moment to gather her thoughts. "I don't have an exact moment, John," she admitted softly, her voice cracking under the strain of her emotions. "It wasn't one sudden change, but a gradual drift. I started feeling invisible, like my needs and desires were being swallowed by the routine of our lives. And then Michael came along, a spark in the darkness that made me feel alive, even if just for a fleeting moment." Her confession was both raw and heartbreaking, a mixture of regret and resignation that underscored the complexity of her inner turmoil. Her words resonated with a painful truth, that our lives had become a series of predictable routines, and in that predictability, she had lost herself. I wanted to believe that love could withstand even the most trying of times, but the depth of her disillusionment made me question whether the foundations of our union were as unshakable as I had once believed. The realization was devastating, yet it compelled me to look inward and examine my own role in our unraveling. In the ensuing days, the dialogue between us became more frequent, albeit still riddled with painful silences and hesitant admissions. We both recognized that the path forward would require us to confront not only the betrayal but also the underlying issues that had allowed it to fester. I began to wonder if our relationship had been built on a fragile veneer of shared dreams, one that could easily fracture under the weight of unspoken desires and unmet expectations. As I sat alone, reflecting on the shattered remnants of our once ideal life, I couldn't help but feel that I was caught in a twilight zone between past and present, a place where nothing was as it seemed. The man I had been, so confident in the stability of his love and his home, now felt diminished by the stark reality of human frailty and the unforeseen cracks in even the strongest bonds. In that quiet, introspective space, I realized that the journey ahead would force me to question not just the integrity of our relationship, but also my understanding of love itself. With each passing moment, the decision loomed larger: should I try to mend the pieces of our broken life, or was it time to accept that some fractures were beyond repair? The questions were as endless as they were painful, and each one threatened to unravel the last threads of the identity I had clung to for so long. I knew one thing for certain: the need for honest introspection had never been more pressing. Emily's confession had laid bare the complexities of our shared existence, revealing the interplay of loneliness, unmet needs, and the insidious creep of discontent. As I stared at the pale light of dawn filtering through the window, I resolved to embark on a journey of self-discovery and honest conversation, even if it meant facing truths that were as unyielding as they were painful. In the solitude of that early morning, I silently vowed to confront not just the external betrayal, but the internal fractures that had led us to this precipice. The road ahead was uncertain, filled with both the promise of renewal and the threat of further heartache. But I had reached a point where the only path forward was to embrace the full spectrum of our shared reality, however raw, unvarnished, and painful it might be. The days following that heart-wrenching morning felt like I was living in a limbo, a place where time both crawled and raced forward, each moment heavy with the promise of irrevocable change. In the silence of our fractured home, I found myself at a crossroads, teetering between the need to salvage what remained of our shared past and the crushing reality that perhaps we had already ventured too far down separate paths. That very afternoon, I sat at my kitchen table, a steaming cup of coffee growing cold by my side, as I tried to map out the tangled web of emotions swirling within me. The remnants of our conversation with Emily replayed like fragments of a broken film reel in my mind. Her quiet confession, laden with regret and resignation, left me questioning every choice I'd ever made. Had I been so blind, so wrapped up in the comfort of our routine, that I failed to notice her silent cries for help? And now, staring at the scattered pieces of our once perfect life, I wondered if the road to healing would demand that I confront not only her betrayal but also the shortcomings within myself. In my isolation, I reached out for guidance, a friend who, over the years, had been a steady pillar of wisdom in my life. I called Michael Harris, a longtime confidant with an uncanny ability to see the truths we often kept hidden from ourselves. Over the phone, his voice resonated with a calm assurance that momentarily eased the storm inside me. "John, I can only imagine how heavy this must feel," he said, his tone empathetic yet measured. "But you need to know that sometimes, the hardest paths lead to the clearest truths." His words, simple yet profound, reminded me that even in the depths of betrayal, there lay a possibility for growth, if I could muster the courage to face the pain head-on. That conversation sparked a turning point. I realized that I had two choices: to sink into a vortex of bitterness and regret, or to embrace this moment as an opportunity for profound personal transformation. The idea of seeking professional help began to take root in my mind. Perhaps therapy, whether alone or as a couple, could help illuminate the dark corners of our relationship that had been neglected for far too long. It was a tentative hope, a lifeline thrown into the turbulent sea of my emotions. Later that day, as the autumn sun dipped low on the horizon, casting long shadows across our quiet neighborhood, I approached Emily. Her eyes, still brimming with unshed tears from our previous conversation, met mine with a mixture of apprehension and longing for reconciliation. I knew that the next step was as much about healing ourselves individually as it was about mending the fractured bond between us. "Emily," I began, my voice wavering between determination and vulnerability, "I've been thinking, maybe we should consider talking to someone, a therapist, perhaps. Not to erase what's happened, but to understand it, and to see if there's a way to move forward, either together or apart, in a way that honors both of our truths." Her silence was palpable. I could see the internal battle reflected in the lines of her face, the unspoken fear that delving into the depths of our pain might shatter any remaining hope for reconciliation. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of hesitation, she responded softly, "John, I'm not sure if I'm ready for that. I'm still trying to come to terms with everything, and I don't know if talking to someone else will change what I feel." Her words stung, yet they were honest, a mirror reflecting the chaos within us both. I understood that healing wasn't something that could be rushed or imposed, it was a process that demanded time, patience, and a willingness to confront truths that often left scars. "I know it's a big step," I replied, choosing my words with care, "but perhaps it's a step we need to take to understand not only each other but also ourselves. We owe it to our past, and to the possibility of a future, to try." That night, as I lay awake in the dim glow of our bedroom lamp, the gravity of the situation settled heavily upon me. The boundaries between right and wrong, love and betrayal, had blurred into a spectrum of raw, unfiltered emotion. I recalled the tender moments we had once shared, quiet breakfasts, stolen glances across crowded rooms, whispered dreams in the dark, and wondered if they were enough to counterbalance the deep pain of her infidelity. In the solitude of my thoughts, I wrestled with a profound realization, that love, in all its multifaceted glory, was not immune to imperfection. It was a living, breathing entity that thrived on honesty and nurtured growth, but it also demanded sacrifice and acceptance of each other's flaws. Could we, after all this, find a way to honor what we once had? Or was this the end of a chapter that had defined so much of our identity? The idea of forgiveness, both of Emily and of myself, hovered at the edge of my consciousness. It wasn't a matter of erasing the past, but rather of understanding it, learning from it, and ultimately deciding whether the scars could coexist with a renewed sense of trust. As the hours slowly ticked by, I came to recognize that the path ahead was not a linear progression from pain to healing. Instead, it was a labyrinth of emotion, where every turn might reveal another painful truth or a glimmer of hope. By the time dawn crept over the horizon, I had made a silent promise to myself, that I would seek out the help I needed, whatever form that might take, and that I wouldn't allow this betrayal to define my worth or dictate the entirety of our future. Whether Emily and I would emerge from this storm together or on separate paths remained uncertain, but I resolved to take each day as it came, to embrace both the joy and the sorrow that defined our shared journey. As the new day broke, I looked out at the world with a renewed sense of purpose. I wasn't sure if the light of morning would banish all the darkness of yesterday, but I knew that every sunrise brought with it the chance for redemption, a chance to learn, to forgive, and perhaps, to rebuild. In the days that followed our difficult conversation, I found myself trapped in an endless cycle of reflection and restless nights. The initial shock of Emily's confession had given way to a persistent ache, a dull, throbbing reminder that nothing would ever be as it once was. Every room in our home echoed with memories, each corner a silent testament to the life we had shared. I felt as if I were listening to echoes of a happier past, now overlaid by the painful cadence of betrayal. I tried to immerse myself in my work as an architect, hoping that the structure and logic of my designs might provide some stability against the swirling chaos in my heart. Yet even the precise lines of my blueprints and the crisp outlines of my drawings seemed to blur with every thought of Emily. Her presence in the house, once a source of comfort, now haunted every room. It was as though the very walls of our home were steeped in secrets, whispering reminders of a love that had fractured beyond repair. Late one night, when sleep evaded me once again, I found myself wandering through our quiet living room. The soft hum of the refrigerator and the distant murmur of the night seemed to blend into a melancholic symphony of regret. I sat on the edge of the worn-out sofa, staring blankly at the muted television screen, trying to reconcile the man I had been with the reality that now confronted me. I recalled the moments before our conversation, the hesitant glances, the strained smiles, the unspoken words, and wondered if I had ever truly known the real Emily, or if I had been blinded by the illusion of what our marriage was meant to be. In those solitary hours, the question of, what next, loomed large. I oscillated between anger and sorrow, clinging to fragments of the past while dreading the inevitable future. I began to wonder if I was destined to remain in this painful limbo, where every day would serve as a reminder of betrayal and every night would be filled with regret. The thought of confronting Emily again filled me with a heavy dread, yet I knew that avoiding the truth was no longer an option. The unresolved tension was a festering wound, and only by facing it could there be any hope, however distant, of healing. At the break of another uncertain morning, I resolved to address the situation more directly. I approached Emily as she prepared a quiet breakfast in the kitchen, her back turned, as if trying to shield herself from the emotional storm that had enveloped us both. "Emily," I said softly, the word laden with a mix of longing and desperation, "we need to talk about what this means for us, about who we are now." Her silence in response was deafening, and in that moment, I realized that the path forward was as much about confronting the shattered pieces of my own identity as it was about reconciling with her. There was no simple answer, only the arduous truth that both of us had to navigate the ruins of our shared past to determine what, if anything, might emerge from the wreckage. The emotional tumult of the previous days had left me feeling as if I were adrift in an endless sea of uncertainty. With every tick of the clock, the quiet despair of our once happy home grew louder, a constant reminder that I needed answers, not just from Emily, but from within myself. In a desperate bid to find some semblance of clarity, I decided to seek professional help. It wasn't a decision made lightly, it was born of countless sleepless nights and an overwhelming need to understand the fractures within my own heart. I scheduled an appointment with Dr. James Carter, a seasoned therapist known for his compassionate approach. Walking into his softly lit office, I felt a strange mixture of apprehension and hope. The room was tranquil, walls adorned with calming art, a shelf lined with books on healing and human resilience, and a comfortable chair that seemed to invite the burdens of my soul to be shared. As I sat down, Dr. Carter's gentle voice broke the silence. "John, tell me what's been weighing on you," he said, his tone both inviting and non-judgmental. For a long moment, I hesitated, trying to gather the scattered fragments of my emotions into a coherent narrative. Then, with a shaky breath, I began recounting the events that had unraveled my once solid world, the whispered suspicions, the note with Michael's name, the painful confrontation with Emily, and the relentless echo of betrayal that now haunted my every thought. Dr. Carter listened intently, nodding occasionally, his eyes reflecting a deep understanding that both comforted and unnerved me. "Betrayal, John, is rarely a simple act, it's often a manifestation of deeper unmet needs and silent suffering on both sides," he observed. His words struck a chord in me. I realized that the wounds we carried were not just inflicted by a single act of infidelity, but were symptoms of a long-standing disconnect that had crept in slowly over the years. It wasn't merely about Emily seeking solace in another, it was about both of us losing touch with the essence of who we once were as a couple. During subsequent sessions, I began peeling back the layers of my own emotional armor. I discovered buried resentments, anger at myself for not noticing the signs, guilt for feeling so vulnerable, and a profound sorrow for the loss of the future I had envisioned with Emily. The therapy sessions became a mirror reflecting the duality of my pain, the personal grief of betrayal and the existential dread of a love that had once promised endless possibilities but had now become an intricate maze of doubt and longing. In one session, I recalled a memory that seemed insignificant at the time, a quiet evening when Emily and I had sat together on the porch, the night sky scattered with stars, and we had spoken about dreams we once cherished. That memory now glowed like a beacon amid the darkness, a reminder of a time when vulnerability was shared freely and without fear. It made me question, had we simply forgotten how to be open with one another? Or had the quiet routines of daily life slowly eroded the emotional intimacy we once nurtured? Armed with this new insight, I found the courage to broach the subject with Emily once more. One evening, when the rain pattered softly against our windows, I sat her down at the kitchen table. "Emily," I began, my voice unsteady but resolute, "I've been trying to understand everything that's happened, and I'm realizing that maybe our issues run deeper than I thought. I'm not just hurting because of the betrayal, I'm hurting because I feel we lost our way, long before any of this." Her eyes, reflective pools of sorrow and regret, searched mine as she whispered, "I'm sorry, John. I never meant for us to drift apart like this. I was lost, and I didn't know how to find my way back." There was an honesty in her voice that resonated with the discoveries I had made in therapy. It wasn't an immediate apology for the affair itself, but an acknowledgement of the emotional distance that had grown between us, a distance that had quietly widened until it was impossible to ignore. That night, after our conversation, I felt a tentative glimmer of understanding, an inkling that perhaps our relationship wasn't beyond repair. Dr. Carter had emphasized that healing was not a linear process, it was a journey with setbacks and breakthroughs, moments of clarity interwoven with deep-seated pain. I resolved then that I would continue my path of introspection, even if it meant confronting uncomfortable truths about myself and our shared past. In the solitude of my study, I scribbled down reflections in a journal, a habit I had long abandoned but now embraced as a vital tool in my quest for healing. Every word on the page was a step toward reconciling the man I was with the man I hoped to become. The betrayal still stung, and the wounds were far from healed, but in those vulnerable moments, I felt a renewed commitment to uncovering the roots of our broken bond. In the weeks that followed my breakthrough with therapy, I found myself cautiously stepping onto a path that promised renewal, though the way was steeped in uncertainty. The once overwhelming storm of betrayal and despair had begun to subside into a gentle drizzle of introspection, one that allowed me moments of clarity amid the lingering pain. I realized that while the scars of our shared past would never fully vanish, they might someday serve as the roadmap to rebuilding a semblance of trust and understanding. One afternoon, as I sat in the quiet corner of our living room with a cup of tea, I decided to write a letter, one not addressed to Emily, but to the part of me that had been shattered by the revelations. I poured out the tangled emotions of hurt, regret, and longing onto the paper. In that raw act of vulnerability, I discovered that the process of forgiveness began with acknowledging my own grief. I wrote about the moments I had taken for granted, the love that had once seemed so invincible, and the painful awareness that the person I had known was no longer the same. This letter became my silent confession, a promise to myself to honor the journey of healing, regardless of the destination. That same evening, after a day filled with small but significant moments of self-discovery, I approached Emily once again. The air between us was still charged with unresolved tension, yet there was also an undercurrent of possibility, a delicate bridge spanning the gap between our separate islands of pain. Over a quiet dinner, I dared to share a fragment of my letter with her. "Emily," I said, my voice tentative yet earnest, "I've been trying to piece together who I am now, and who we might become, even after all this. I've come to see that our past, no matter how painful, doesn't have to define our future." Her eyes, long accustomed to sorrow and guarded secrets, softened ever so slightly as she listened. "I wish I could remember that version of us," she whispered, her voice laced with both regret and a fragile hope. It was a moment of shared vulnerability, a silent acknowledgement that perhaps, buried beneath layers of betrayal and neglect, there still remained a core of love that was worth fighting for. Encouraged by this glimmer of mutual understanding, we tentatively began to explore ways to reconnect. We started with small acts, a shared walk around the neighborhood at dusk, a quiet conversation over a cup of coffee, moments where the ghosts of the past were met with deliberate silence and gentle acknowledgement rather than angry confrontation. These small steps were not without setbacks. Old habits and lingering resentments would sometimes resurface unbidden. Yet each time, I reminded myself that healing was not about erasing the past, but about accepting it and choosing to move forward despite the pain. During one of our rare peaceful evenings, I found myself reflecting on the wisdom Dr. Carter had imparted. Healing was a journey without a fixed destination, a series of steps both forward and backward. I began to see that the fractures within our relationship were not solely about Emily's betrayal or my own blindness, but about the deep-seated vulnerabilities that we both carried into our marriage. In acknowledging our imperfections, we started to carve out a space where real dialogue could take root, one where every shared silence was an opportunity to rebuild the bridges that had crumbled under the weight of unspoken words. As autumn deepened into winter, the chill in the air mirrored the cool, cautious distance that still separated us at times. Yet even in the cold, there was a promise, a quiet resilience that urged us not to surrender to the bitterness of what had been lost. I continued my therapy sessions, each one peeling back another layer of long-held fears and misconceptions. Slowly, I began to see not just the betrayal, but also the parts of myself that had been waiting to be understood and healed. In the midst of this internal metamorphosis, I realized that the renewal I sought was not contingent solely on mending the bond with Emily, but also on rediscovering the core of my own identity. I resolved to embrace the future with a heart that had been both wounded and enlightened by the journey of betrayal and self-reflection. Whether our paths would eventually converge or diverge, I knew that the process of healing had already planted the seeds for a more honest, resilient version of myself. In the midst of our tentative steps toward healing, I began to sense that our journey was reaching a critical juncture, a moment when the past and our present would force us to make a choice about the future. Every therapy session, every quiet conversation with Emily, and every introspective night spent pouring my heart out into a journal had led me to this point, a crossroads where our individual paths might either converge once more or irrevocably diverge. One chilly evening, as a soft rain tapped against the window panes, Emily and I found ourselves sitting in the dim light of our living room. The remnants of our shared meals and long-forgotten laughter seemed to linger in the corners, a bittersweet reminder of what once was. The air was heavy with unsaid words, and I knew that the silence was preparing us for the conversation that had long been inevitable. "John," Emily began hesitantly, her voice barely rising above a whisper, "I've been thinking about everything, our past, our pain, and this fragile hope we're trying to rebuild." Her eyes, a mirror of vulnerability and resolve, met mine. "I wonder if we can truly reclaim what we lost, or if some parts of us are destined to remain broken." Her words struck a chord deep within me, a raw acknowledgement that, despite our efforts, the wound might never fully heal. I took a moment to collect my thoughts, feeling both the weight of our shared history and the burden of choices yet to be made. "Emily," I replied softly, "I've been reflecting a lot, too. Therapy has helped me understand that healing isn't a straight path, and sometimes, moving forward means accepting that things might never be exactly as they once were. I've realized that while I still cherish the memories we created, I'm also learning to recognize who I am beyond them." As the conversation deepened, it became clear that our perspectives were shifting in ways we could no longer ignore. For me, the journey of self-discovery had opened a door to a new identity, one forged by the trials of betrayal and reborn through introspection and acceptance. I found myself standing at the edge of an inner transformation, grappling with the truth that clinging to a past that no longer existed might hinder the possibility of growth. Emily, too, revealed layers of her inner world that I had never fully seen before. "I've been struggling with guilt and regret," she admitted, her voice trembling with emotion. "I miss the person I used to be, the person I hoped you'd always see. But sometimes, I wonder if I've lost myself in the maze of choices that led to this moment." Her confession was both heartbreaking and liberating, a moment of unguarded honesty that underscored the complexity of our situation. In that shared vulnerability, we began to acknowledge a painful reality: the journey we had embarked on might not lead us back to the comforting embrace of our former selves. Instead, it was steering us toward a future where the scars of our past would serve as both a reminder and a guide. We spoke of the possibility that our paths, while intertwined for so long, might now be pulling in different directions, a truth that was as daunting as it was inevitable. I remember feeling an unexpected calm as I considered the notion that the end of our familiar life might also be the beginning of something new. It wasn't a surrender to defeat but rather an acceptance of the natural evolution of love and identity. "Emily," I said slowly, "maybe the healing we need isn't just about mending our relationship. Perhaps it's about acknowledging that we've changed, and that sometimes, growing apart is part of that change." Her eyes welled with tears, not solely of sorrow, but also of recognition. "I never wanted to hurt you, John. And I never intended for us to lose ourselves along the way. But maybe we have reached a point where holding on is causing more pain than letting go." The words hung between us, a fragile yet undeniable truth. In that quiet moment, I understood that the decision before us was not one of blame or failure, but of acceptance. The love we once knew was still there, embedded in our shared history and the countless moments of tenderness we had experienced. Yet, it was also clear that clinging to that past without acknowledging the changes we had undergone would only deepen our wounds. As the rain continued its steady cadence against the windows, I felt a bittersweet clarity wash over me. I realized that the choice wasn't about erasing our past but about deciding how we would honor it as we stepped into the future, whether together or apart. It was a turning point where the pain of betrayal had given way to the possibility of renewal, even if that renewal meant embarking on separate journeys of self-discovery. That night, I lay awake reflecting on the conversation, feeling the profound weight of the choice before us. I knew that tomorrow would bring no simple answers, only the gradual unfolding of truths that had been hidden in the spaces between our words. And as I stared into the darkness, I understood that sometimes, the bravest act of love is to let go, so that both souls may have the freedom to heal and to find their true path, even if it leads away from one another. In the days that followed our profound conversation, the reality of our decision began to settle in, a truth that was both painful and liberating. I found myself navigating a maze of memories, reflections, and difficult questions about what the future might hold. The choice we had faced, whether to continue together or to part ways, was not made lightly. It came after countless nights of introspection, moments of raw vulnerability, and the courage to accept that sometimes love, no matter how deep it once ran, must be transformed rather than preserved in its old form. I spent the morning in a state of quiet contemplation. The soft light of dawn filtered through the window, casting gentle shadows across the room that once witnessed the height of our passion and the depths of our despair. I took a deep breath and opened a new journal, a blank canvas on which I could write not just my regrets and losses, but also the promise of a future unburdened by the past. Every stroke of my pen was both an act of mourning and a declaration of hope, a commitment to honor the love we had shared without allowing it to confine what I might become. As the weeks unfolded, Emily and I navigated the difficult terrain of separation with as much grace as we could muster. We both knew that letting go did not mean erasing the memories that had defined our lives for so long. Instead, it was about acknowledging that we had grown into different people. The betrayal, the pain, and the introspection had all left indelible marks on us, marks that would forever be part of our stories, but which no longer had to dictate the course of our futures. I began to structure my days around small, deliberate acts of renewal. Mornings were now a time for quiet reflection and a slow cup of coffee while watching the world wake up, each sunrise a reminder that every ending carried with it the seeds of a new beginning. I returned to the drawing board, both literally, with my architectural designs, and figuratively, as I started to reimagine who I was beyond the role of a husband defined by love and betrayal. The creative process, once my refuge, now became the medium through which I rebuilt my identity. With each design and each sketch, I felt a step closer to the man I hoped to become, a man who had learned to see beauty in imperfection and strength in vulnerability. There were moments of aching nostalgia, days when the echoes of our laughter and the warm comfort of shared routines would tug at my heart. But interwoven with those memories was a quiet resolve. I realized that holding on to the illusion of what we once had would only impede the growth we both needed. Emily, too, was forging her own path. Though our interactions had grown less frequent and more formal, there was a mutual respect in the way we acknowledged our shared history. In our final days as a couple, we worked together to untangle the complexities of joint decisions, dividing possessions, sorting through mementos, and discussing practicalities with a surprising tenderness. It was as if we were both saying goodbye to an old chapter while leaving the door open for a different kind of connection, one that was rooted not in romantic love but in the deep understanding of two souls who had once intertwined so completely. I recall one crisp evening when I met Emily one last time to exchange keepsakes, an old photograph, a handwritten note, small tokens that carried the weight of our past. We sat together on the back porch, the cool air filled with the scent of fallen leaves and the soft murmur of distant traffic. There was a long pause as we both absorbed the gravity of the moment. "John," Emily said gently, "I want you to know that despite everything, I will always cherish what we had." Her voice trembled slightly, but there was also an air of acceptance, as if she, too, had come to understand that some stories, no matter how beautiful, must reach their natural conclusion. I replied, "And I will always remember you, Emily, not as someone who hurt me, but as someone who taught me how to love, and how to let go when love evolves." In that moment, I felt a sense of closure that had eluded me for so long. It was not a dramatic ending, but rather a quiet, mutual acknowledgement that our lives were moving in different directions. We embraced, a gesture that spoke of gratitude, sorrow, and an unspoken promise to cherish the lessons we had learned together. In the months that followed our separation, I embarked on a journey of self-discovery that was as much about healing as it was about growth. Therapy continued to be a steady companion, and I surrounded myself with supportive friends and family who reminded me that life's greatest challenges often pave the way for its most profound transformations. I traveled, explored new ideas, and even started taking up painting, an art form that allowed me to express the spectrum of emotions that words could no longer capture. Each brushstroke on the canvas was a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, reminder that even shattered fragments could be reassembled into something unexpected and beautiful. One evening, as I walked along a bustling street in a city that was both unfamiliar and invigorating, I found myself smiling at the spontaneity of life. I had come to understand that the future, though uncertain, was brimming with possibilities. The pain of betrayal had gradually softened, replaced by a gentle awareness that every experience, no matter how painful, contributed to the mosaic of who I was. I embraced the solitude that once felt like a punishment, transforming it instead into an opportunity for creative expression and personal freedom. Looking back on the tumultuous journey, from the initial shock of betrayal to the slow, steady process of healing, I realized that every heartbreak had been a catalyst for growth. The betrayal that had once threatened to define my entire identity now served as a reminder of the fragility of trust and the enduring strength of the human heart. I learned that forgiveness, in its truest form, was not about absolving the other person of their mistakes, but about releasing myself from the chains of resentment and sorrow. It was about accepting the past, embracing the present, and having the courage to step into the future with an open heart. Today, I write these reflections not to glorify the pain, but to honor the journey, a journey that taught me that love is a living, breathing entity, one that can transform and adapt even in the face of betrayal. My life has taken on new dimensions, enriched by the scars that once seemed unbearable. I now see the beauty in impermanence, the art in letting go, and the promise of renewal in every ending. I am no longer the man who clung desperately to a shattered illusion of perfection. Instead, I have learned to appreciate the truth that our lives are a series of evolving chapters. Each chapter, with its joys and sorrows, has added depth to my character and clarity to my purpose. And while the memory of our past remains etched in my heart, it no longer confines me. I have embraced a future where I can love again, first by loving myself, and then, perhaps someday, by opening my heart to another in a way that honors the lessons of the past. As I close this final chapter of our shared story, I stand at the threshold of a new beginning. The future is unwritten, filled with both promise and mystery, and I welcome it with gratitude and hope. For in every ending lies the seed of a new beginning, and in every goodbye, there is the silent promise of tomorrow.